back to the Empowered Podcast. My name is Emily Arth. I am a psychotherapist, an educator, and a creator. And this is a place where I teach you how to connect your head and your heart to live the most abundant life possible. You're tuning in to an exciting series that I've been doing called The Healers Guild, in which I have had the honor of interviewing many different healers from an eclectic variety of backgrounds who have told us about how their modalities can help people overcome difficulties in their life. Today, I will not be interviewing anyone. However, I will be taking this opportunity to speak to you about the work that I do as a trauma therapist, to talk about my story of how I became a trauma therapist, and to give you a picture of more specifically what I do and how it helps people overcome difficulties in their life. But before I begin, I'm coming to you today from a different environment than usual. I am actually in my bed because my bed is one of my safe spaces. When I've had a hard day, the first place I want to be is laying down and covered up with a blanket. And so in preparation for my origin story of how I became a trauma therapist, I thought I would model the importance of taking care of yourself because the story that I'm going to tell you may be a little bit different than some of the stories that we've heard from other healers. Because indeed, my origin story is a story of my life to some extent. Sure, this is not every piece of the story of my life, but this has been an overarching theme in my life, has been much experience of trauma, as well as learning how to heal myself and overcome those traumatic events. But the tool that I use to heal people is primarily rooted in the tool of personal narrative. And so in order to show you the power of personal narrative and the power of the work that I do, I wanted to model for you my own narrative and my own story so that you can experience a little piece of what I have the honor of experiencing every day as I work with survivors of many forms of trauma. So my origin story begins a long time ago when I was about 5 years old. I had just started kindergarten. And I woke up one morning, I came out of my room, and my mother, who was maybe about 6.5 months or so pregnant with my little brother, who is my only sibling, she was laying on the floor in my living room, and her legs were propped up on the couch, and she had beach towels soaked with blood between her legs. Now, you can imagine I was in shock. As a 5-year-old, I didn't know what I was seeing. I didn't know why she was bleeding, where this blood was coming from. All I knew is that my mom appeared to be dying. Well, luckily, my dad was home. My dad is a physician, but he was panicked as well, of course. And he was yelling at me to get ready. Emily, we have to go to the hospital. And so I put my clothes on and I get in the front seat of the car. My dad gets my mom in the back seat of the car. Again, she's still bleeding out. And we drive the 20 minutes to the hospital where she's given a blood transfusion. They stop the bleeding and she ultimately survives. However, what was happening was she was experiencing something called placenta previa, where the placenta detaches from the uterine wall and you're bleeding out because all of your blood goes through your placenta. So because this had happened, she had to be at bed rest for 6 weeks prior to giving birth to my brother, and she was hospitalized an hour and a half away from the town where we lived. So for 6 weeks, she was in a hospital an hour and a half away. My dad and I would go visit her on the weekends. And so I bonded with the nurses there. You know, it felt like my home away from home while that was going on. And they were giving her shots to develop my brother more quickly. So she ultimately delivered him a month early. They took him early and she hemorrhaged while they were taking him out. And so she, again, had this near-death experience where they had to do an emergency hysterectomy to remove her uterus in order to save her life. And so this was very traumatic. My brother, when he was born, he was in the NICU. So we were visiting him in the NICU, and his eating reflex was not fully developed. So they, were feeding him through a tube that went up his nose and down into his throat. And then when he finally got to go home, we had a terrifying event where my grandmother and my mother were in the house with me. My dad was outside doing yard work, and my brother stopped breathing, right? He just started turning blue. And nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what to do. I was just screaming at the top of my lungs, Eli, breathe, Eli, breathe. And my mom and my grandma, were responding by rushing him out, getting him in the car, and again, driving the 20 minutes to the nearest hospital. And he did survive. What happened was his breathing reflexes also were not fully developed. So then he was on an apnea monitor for 9 months, which would beep essentially when he would stop breathing. And so there would be times when he was sleeping and he would just not be breathing involuntarily. And so this beeping would go off until you startled him a little bit and got him to breathe. So at this point, right, but before 6, I had witnessed the near-death experience of my mother, the near-death experience of my brother. And then at about the age of 8, my dad, when he was 40, developed severe asthma just suddenly. And he had a series of very scary asthma attacks. And so one day he was home alone with me and my brother, and he let his asthma attack go on too long. He thought that he could gain control of it, and he couldn't. And so my brother was maybe 2 years old or so at the time. And so my dad gets us in the car, and again, I'm in the front seat of the car. My brother's in the back seat, and we are driving the 20 minutes to the hospital. And my dad is just becoming more and more constricted. And he's literally whistling a high-pitched whistle as he breathes in. And he's just crying. He's just sobbing and holding his side because he's in so much pain. And again, right, my 8-year-old self is thinking, my dad is dying and we're in the car with him, and what's going to happen? And so we make it to the hospital. He runs inside. Luckily, the staff at the hospital knew him and immediately attended to him. But they told him that he had about 30 seconds before he would have been completely closed off. So again, I was in a state of terror when we got there. I remember sitting behind the nurse's counter because I was a doctor's child, and these nurses attending to me and calming me down as I was watching my dad, with all the medical staff responding to him. So some really terrifying medical events happened to me when I was young. In addition to this, I have a mother with untreated mental illness. So my whole life, my mother has struggled from depression, insomnia, anxiety, and she's never really sought treatment for that. And so that was a stressor in our relationship. It definitely interfered with our healthy bonding. Growing up, I would very frequently ask her, do you love me? Do you love me? Because I just never formed that healthy bond, that healthy emotional attachment with her. So that also is a form of trauma when you have a parent who has an untreated mental illness. I also am a survivor of sexual abuse. At the ages of 6 and 12, I was molested numerous times by a family friend of ours, her teenage son. And then when I was 15 years old, my first sexual experience was having my head held down and being forced to perform oral sex. So I have a history of sexual abuse. And then by the time I was a teenager, you can imagine I was having my own anxiety and my own depression, and also experiencing a lot of anger toward my parents, and internally I knew that a lot of this anger felt irrational. I didn't understand it, but I still had it. And my parents didn't know how to deal with it either. They didn't have the skills or the knowledge to respond to me in a an empathic, compassionate way. And so there was a lot of shaming. I was called names, mean names by my parents. I was told that I was a spoiled brat. I was told that I was ungrateful. I was told that I was crazy. And so since nobody was practicing any accountability for their part in the problem, and I was being blamed for my emotional reaction, by the time I went to college, I truly believed that I was crazy and that I had a problem. And, to some extent, emotionally, I had a problem because I didn't know how to deal with my emotions. But I didn't know that this problem was not a fundamental flaw of who I am. And so I entered my adulthood with a pretty crippling amount of shame. When I went to college, I had huge social anxiety. I remember just walking to class was an ordeal for me. I was just in my head the whole time, constantly comparing myself, constantly criticizing myself. It was just like an endless barrage of self-hatred and feelings of not enough. And so it was not until I was in graduate school in my early 20s, and I was studying social work. And I was actually in my clinical theories class, and we were talking about trauma. And on the PowerPoint, there was a checklist of all of these common symptoms of individuals who have post-traumatic stress disorder or who have become traumatized. And I remember just sitting there thinking, that's me, that's me, that's me. Oh, wow, I need some help. And so even though it was a realization that I was traumatized, which isn't always the best realization to have, it was also hopeful to know what was happening, that this was not a fundamental flaw of who I was. This was a symptomatic reaction to my life experiences and to my development and to the response that I got around those things. Right. And for many people, it's not going through something traumatic that causes pathology. It is the lack of healthy response around those traumatic events. And in my life, like the sexual abuse, for example, I never disclosed that to my family because I was afraid of being blamed or shamed or punished or seen in a negative light. And so I didn't have trust there that I would get emotionally what I needed. And so I just didn't disclose that at all. And honestly, it wasn't even really until about my mid-20s that I came into the full realization that I was a survivor of sexual abuse, which shows you how deeply ingrained some of that denial can be around those types of issues. So once I figured out that I was traumatized, that started me on this path of my own healing because, as I was becoming a social worker, they put huge emphasis on self-care and on doing your own work before you can help other people. And so I came into contact with an incredible psychotherapist, very powerful woman who set me on this journey of healing that was very profound and ultimately life-changing. And I would cite psychotherapy as the core of my healing. But beyond that, I started to realize that trauma has a systematic impact on us. There is a saying in trauma treatment that the issues are stored in the tissues, meaning that this trauma is not just stored in your mind and your memory, but it's also stored within your body. And so it's not just healing the mind, it's also healing the body. And some of the modalities that are required to do that work directly with the body. For example, craniosacral therapy, which works with the fascia. The fascia is like a network that connects everything in your body and holds it all together. It's believed that the fascia is where the soul lives in your body. Well, trauma creates a lot of restrictions in the fascia, which can create a lot of chronic pain issues and pain that can't really be identified in traditional medicine in terms of, you don't have anything out of place. Your labs look normal. You don't have any broken bones. So where is this pain coming from? Well, the pain is ultimately coming from the brain, because in trauma, when you go through a painful experience on a chronic basis, meaning you have repeated episodes of events that take place in your life that put your brain in this fight, flight, or freeze mode, what happens is the physical brain develops in an unhealthy way. It actually becomes an unbalanced brain that is bottom heavy, meaning the home of the fear response is bigger than it needs to be. And the frontal cortex of the brain, the wise mind, is smaller than it needs to be. And so, again, we have to heal not just the brain, but also the body. And that requires a multifaceted approach. And so that brought me into the world of all kinds of healing modalities, where I've had the opportunity to, work with people who work with the body directly. I've had to work on my hormones. Again, trauma causes higher levels of cortisol to be released. Cortisol is the hormone that kicks off adrenaline. Well, in a healthy experience, we don't have this reaction happen very commonly. And when it does happen, you get a jolt of these chemicals in your body that then very quickly come down. When you're in a situation where your life involves chronic, even lower level forms of trauma, you're getting too much of these chemicals going through your body. And the problem is that these chemicals actually damage the endocrine system in your body, right? This is like your thyroid, your pituitary, your adrenal glands. And these parts of your body are responsible for managing your hormones. And hormones are paramount to managing most other systems, including your mood. And so, yes, so all throughout my 20s, though I advocated for myself with my doctors, I felt that my hormones were out of balance. No one would test my hormones for 10 years. And finally, I went to a doctor who specializes in human hormone replacement. And I found that my body does not break down the chemical that turns into your sex hormones. So testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So I had almost zero of all three of those hormones in my body, which you can imagine caused all kinds of problems for me, weight gain, mood instability, tiredness, lack of motivation, so many problems. And so getting that sorted out was another key component to my healing journey. So hopefully this has been a little summarized view of the story that brought me into the realization that trauma is hugely impactful on our overall health, and that healing that, I really believe, is the key to well-being and to wholeness. And so the work that I do as a trauma therapist, I am an expert in treating a condition called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a little different from classic PTSD. Classic PTSD is associated with like a single event. So someone who might have been in a wartime event or been in a car accident or something like that may develop what you more classically see examples of on TV or something like that. People who have flashbacks, a lot of nightmares, a lot of avoidance, things like that. But complex post-traumatic stress disorder is actually more of a developmental problem. And most of my clients have stories similar to the story that I just shared with you that involves a series of traumatic events that took place in their life that put them in an overly activated state of fight, flight, or freeze. And so by the time they reach their adulthood, they have a constellation of symptoms that include instability of mood. So that could be depression, anxiety, typically a lot of feelings of shame. Shame is one of the primary byproducts of trauma. Feelings of low self-esteem, low self-worth, problems with dissociation. So that could be lack of concentration and focus, feeling daydreamy a lot, feeling like you're just zoning out. Avoidance is a major symptom of CPTSD. So this could be avoidance of my own feelings, avoidance of social interactions, avoidance of really anything that causes me distress. So that could show up as procrastination or something like that. As well as a lot of people experience thoughts of suicide, even if that's just thoughts of like, I wish I was dead, that would be easier than being here, all the way up to people who have been, actively suicidal, as well as self-harm. Self-harm could be as, seemingly benign as overeating, all the way up to really notably self-inflicted harm, such as beating yourself, cutting yourself, burning, picking, nail biting. All of that kind of can fall into the self-harm category. And so this is a constellation of symptoms that make up CPTSD, as well as, I didn't mention a lot of ruminating. So thinking about negative past experiences. So when you're going through your day, something may happen that just reminds you of a negative past experience. That looks different than a flashback. That's not a full body re-experiencing. You can have that, but the majority of people that I work with just have a rumination on negative past experiences from their life, as well as bad dreams and nightmares. And a lot of people I work with who have had this condition for many years will tell me that they used to have a lot of nightmares and now they just don't remember their dreams at all anymore. And so along with that, a general sense of emotional numbing is also a common symptom of CPTSD. And that comes from the fact that our bodies will only allow us to feel so much distress before we just start shutting it down completely. Because feeling numb is better than feeling a sense of misery and despair 24/7. So this is the client population that I work best with. This is the heart and soul of my practice. And the therapy that I deliver to work with this, first and foremost, I start with shame resiliency therapy. So anyone who's heard of Dr. Brené Brown and the work of Dr. Brené Brown, that work is about resiliency. And resiliency is about our ability to bounce back from difficult life events. So when you grow up in an environment where you're not having healthy emotional skills being modeled for you, what happens is you do not develop very strong resilience. And we find that the majority of the population, at least in America, lacks resiliency skills in general. We are a population that stays pretty removed from emotions and does not do a good job of giving society at large a foundation for emotional health. And so many of us grow up to be adults who have a general lack of resiliency. And so shame resilience is like a toolkit of skills that helps an individual have what they need to deal with the problems that are naturally going to come up in life, because everybody's life has problems, everybody has failures, everybody has disappointments. But we want to be able to bounce back from those things as quickly as possible when they happen. And, first of all, we have to be able to even recognize that those things are happening, which many people with CPTSD struggle with, because our measure of when things are out of balance, our measure is off. It's kind of like if I've been carrying a weight on my back for 20 years, and you put, 2 more pounds on my back, I'm not really going to notice that very much because I'm just carrying weight on me all the time. Whereas someone who doesn't have a weight on their back, if you put 2 pounds on their back, they can probably feel it. So with that example, you can imagine then that having CPTSD puts people at risk, not just of emotional instability and distress, but physical problems. In fact, one of the most famous studies done by the CDC is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And this is a study that looks at 10 common forms of trauma that people can experience before the age of 18. And these are called adverse childhood experiences. And what this study found is that as your number of adverse childhood experiences increases, your likelihood of developing physical or mental illness, especially chronic illness in adulthood, also increases exponentially. In fact, trauma before the age of 18 through this study has been shown to be the single most predictive factor to whether or not you will develop chronic illness in adulthood. So hopefully that fact alone will show you how incredibly important it is for us to heal trauma, because it is paramount to our overall health. So back to resiliency skills. I start with my clients typically with resiliency skills. This is like if you've ever read about reparenting. Shame resilience is like the skills necessary for reparenting. You know, we talk about healthy permission. We talk about core values so that we can have a sense of authentic purpose and know how to align with our own authenticity. We talk about trust and boundaries around trust. How does healthy trust work? We talk about empathy, what it is and how to enact it, both with ourselves and other people. Talk about self-compassion, again, what it is and how do I enact self-compassion with me? We talk about shame. What is shame? What is the difference between shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment? Because there is a huge difference. We talk about our shame triggers, you know, how they originated throughout our childhood and what they are, because they will continue to show up in our life, especially if we're unaware of them. And we talk about our identity, right? How we want to identify in the world, and how when we aren't showing up as our ideal identities, how that can trigger feelings of shame and how we work with that. So with my clients, I start by giving them a healthy emotional foundation of resiliency. And then we move into doing trauma-specific work, which is narrative therapy. This is where we go through and we actually tell the story of the traumatic thing, the bad thing. And we help the brain put all of the pieces together. Because when you go through trauma, what happens is your system gets overwhelmed. It's like getting hit with an emotional Mack truck. You can't process everything at once. And so it's like you have these loose leaf papers of that experience that are floating around in your brain, wanting to be resolved, wanting to be filed away. And so that's why these ruminations of the past, these nightmares, these negative emotions, all of these thoughts, beliefs, they get triggered over and over again, because it's actually our brains telling us there's something that needs to be cleaned up. There's something that's unresolved. You know, essentially your inner child is still back here waiting for you to come and be their parent, to be the person who was not there for them around this event. So that once we grieve, once we validate the feelings, once we make sense of what happened, then we can move forward together. And so narrative therapy is really when we're alchemizing the experience, right? We're entering the cave, and then we're coming out with the gold, with the wisdom that we can take forward with us from this event once we've healed the emotions that are there. So that is the work that I do. I have the joy of working with ages across the spectrum, right? I work with ages as young as 3. I think my oldest client's been 89 years old. And so I really get the opportunity to not only work with all these different ages and see how this manifests across the lifespan, but also to see how it shows its face across our lives, because it definitely shows up differently depending on our age and depending on what level of development we're at. So this is my great passion. I am so grateful that I get to do this work. I truly believe that healing trauma is the key to healing all of the foundational issues of hurt that we see happening in our society right now. But that healing definitely starts one person at a time, one individual at a time, deciding to heal their hurts. And that is really the most powerful catalyst for changing the world, right? One person at a time. We say hurt people hurt people. So I hope you take that with you when you go out into the world and you see hurt happening, that maybe that will hold you in a compassionate space, when you can remind yourself that those who hurt are hurting themselves, and those who are hurt do have the opportunity to heal. So if you are one of those people and you're seeking healing from me, or if you would like a referral to another incredible healer, I would be happy to help you out. At the end of this video, you'll see a link to my website with all of my information. So thank you for making space for my story. I would love to make space for your story as well. I cherish you all from the bottom of my heart, sending you abundant love. Until next time, farewell.